But for this next event, we're delighted to have a great friend, two friends of the festival in fact, both have appeared many times previously. Jane Ohlmeyer is going to be talking with Patrick Geoghegan about her book, Making Empire, Ireland, Imperialism and the Early Modern World. There will be time for questions afterwards, and Jane will be happy to sign copies of the book. And I'll leave Patrick to do the proper introduction. So thank you very much.
No. Thank you so much. Well, I tell you, it is great to see such a large crowd on a Saturday afternoon to talk about Irish history and empire and all of these complicated and knotty questions. And there is no better person for us to be talking to today than Professor Jane Ohlmeyer. She's the Erasmus Smith Professor of Modern History at Trinity College Dublin. She's the author of this brilliant new book that has been causing such a stir, Making Empire, Ireland, Imperialism and the Early Modern World, published by Oxford University Press. But she's also someone who has been such a champion of scholarship throughout her life, and you've seen it when she was the head of the Irish Research Council, in her work as the head of the director of Trinity's Research Institute for the Arts and Humanities, the Trinity Long Room Hub, in her work as a professor in Trinity. And now what you really see with books like Making Empire, the way it is inspiring a new generation of Irish scholars to look anew at our very complicated past, our relationship with empire, and has kick-started a whole set of debates about our history. And Jane, I just wanted to begin with the question really about your holidays, because you're just back from Peru, but even when you were on your holidays, you couldn't escape Irish history.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for coming today, everybody. Yes, I broke my leg back in January, and as I couldn't bear weight on it for 6 weeks, so I decided that I wanted to walk the Inca Trail and to see the Inca Empire. I'd always wanted to go to Machu Picchu. Folks, don't leave it till you're 61. Do it because it's a really hard trek. But I've always been fascinated by empires. So as I was exploring the Inca Empire, I was thinking about the comparisons with Ireland and obviously Ireland's experiences of empire. But I also had the opportunity then to go into the Peruvian Amazon and a place called Iquitos. And this is what Patrick is referring to, because even now, has anyone been to Iquitos? I mean, it's very remote. It's a town that really got going in the 19th century as part of the rubber boom. But the man who is treated as one of the founding fathers of Iquitos was called Fitzcarraldo. There was a big film about him. But he's a Fitzgerald. And he was one of the people who, as I say, put Iquitos on the map. He made an absolute fortune in the rubber boom. His father was of Irish provenance, his mother was Peruvian. But when I started to do some digging, I found that Fitzcarraldo's rubber plantation and many of the other big rubber barons had Irish overseers on their plantation, including an O'Donnell from Donegal, where I spent a lot of time. And I was finding that these men were really guilty of what today we would call genocide, in terms of how they were treating the indigenous Peruvians and the Tupis and the Putumayo, the various tribes that live along the Amazon. So on the one hand, there was that story. On the other hand, everywhere I went, there was Roger Casement. There was a talk earlier today about Roger Casement, and Roger Casement is revered both in Peru but also in Brazil as the first humanitarian, because it was Roger Casement, through the reports that he made, particularly about the Putumayo, that actually helped to put an end to the atrocities committed by the rubber barons. So he did it in Belgian Congo, and I think people are very familiar about that, but actually what happened in the Amazon was equally heinous in terms of what was being, these atrocities that were being committed, and it was Casement that really called this out, put an end to it. And as I say, you know, there were wall murals of Casement. You would go into every museum, and one of the first people you would see was Roger Casement. He was only there for 6 weeks, but it really brought home to me, Patrick, just what a complicated story this is. And here I was least expecting to find Ireland.
But there you found it. And can we ask about the origins of the book? Because it started with the Ford Lectures, a very prestigious lecture series in Oxford. And Jane was the first Irish-based scholar to be invited to give the lectures in, I think it was 40 years, it was back to FSL lines. And usually they're delivered in Oxford, a small number of people attend, but that wasn't the case when you were giving them in 2021, because of course we were in the middle of the pandemic and the world had shut down, and that changed the way they were delivered completely.
It really did. Remember the pandemic? Sometimes I think we try to block it out, but you're right, Patrick. I had to give the Ford Lectures and with no audience. And I ended up giving them some in Trinity and some in Ivy House in accordance with COVID rules. So there was just literally a film crew there and me. And they were then broadcast remotely, they were broadcast on the Oxford, I guess, whatever blackboard they had, whatever way of broadcasting them. But they subsequently went on to the RTE website. And the last time I checked, over 20,000 people had downloaded them. Now, it doesn't mean 20,000 people watched them, but there was, I mean, that's phenomenal. So if I had given them in person in Oxford, maybe 20 people, 50 people would have shown up. But the fact that I was able to do them remotely, there was a silver lining in the cloud. Didn't mean you get a fellowship at All Souls, which is one of those sort of really, well, I was going to say it's every academic dreams of having a fellowship at All Souls. But anyway, it didn't work for me. But I was in a way happy because Oxford is such an got a very interesting history, and the very fact that the whole statues must fall movement in the UK really began not just with Oxford and the statue of Rhodes that hangs outside Oriel, but also with Coulson and the All Souls Library. So at one level, I was sorry not to be there in that particular place talking about some of these issues. But as I say, there was a silver lining in that I was able to give them remotely, and far more people saw them.
Far more people saw them. And if you went on social media after they were delivered, you had people saying, great lecture, loved it. And then you had other people who were furious that anything negative was being said about any Irish people whatsoever, and who were very much reacting against it. So there were these heated debates generated. There
were. Little did I think it would generate such controversy, because I look at empire through the prism of early modern Ireland, sort of 1550 to about 1700, rather than the contemporary period. But nonetheless, there was a huge debate. I think, though, the debate, I don't know if anybody's being trolled on social media. It's not for the faint-hearted. It's deeply personal. It's very unpleasant. But it made me even more determined to actually have a conversation and say it's only by actually doing empirical research and fully understanding the complexities of these thorny issues that we'll ever be able to have open and hopefully empirically formed debate, but to do so in a respectful way. And my issue with social media, of course, is it is so toxic. But what was so heartening, Patrick, were people who responded to it. And they said, well, my aunt, my grandfather had worked in India or was a nurse serving in the British Army or had some link with empire, and we always felt a little bit ashamed about it. By having this conversation in a very respectful way, it allows us actually to embrace our own very personal associations with empire in all of its guises. And for me, it's also a very personal story. I was born in a place called Kitwe, which is in now modern-day Zambia. And my mother was a teacher in the 1950s. She couldn't get a job here in Ireland, so she basically was a teacher in Africa, and it was economic necessity that pushed her there. And then obviously she stayed, and I was born there. And I think when we think about empire, thinking about why people participated, it's very, very complicated. And many people are, not that they're ideologically signed up to it, on the contrary, they're simply trying to make a living.
The book was launched by Simon Harris just a few weeks before he became Taoiseach, and in his speech he seemed to be drawing out all of those global connections, the story of the Irish in India, around the world, and intrigued by all those elements, that the uncomfortable elements, Ireland as a colonizer as well as being colonized.
Yeah, obviously it was a huge privilege that the now Taoiseach launched the book. He was then Minister of Higher Education. And again, I think it's very important that our politicians, leaders of civil society, are very open to these discussions. Micheál Martin would be another good example. I mean, they're very mature, because we look at the UK, the United States, the way history has become a political and propaganda weapon, and to have a much more balanced and holistic view, as our Taoiseach in this case has, was really heartening, I think. And I think it encourages people like me or historians to say, well, you know, okay, it's a complicated story. Ireland was England's first colony, and we were very much, if you want, victims of colonization. And that's the narrative that has been obviously one that many people, that's the narrative people want to hear. People feel much less comfortable when we're talking about the Fitzcarraldos or the O'Donnells, who were, if you want, the colonizers and active, if you want, perpetrators of imperialism in the British Empire, or actually in the empires of the other European powers. But actually, it's really important that we do have that conversation. It's not about judging, it's about understanding, and he clearly recognized that. But I have to just say one thing about people in book launches. I've had very good fortune, because back in 2018, we produced the Cambridge History of Ireland, and we were launching it, and Michael D. Higgins launched it here in Dublin, and John Major, who was the former Tory Prime Minister, launched it in London. And we were thinking, you know, who can we ask to launch it in Washington? And the then Vice President Joe Biden actually launched it. So no sooner had he launched the Cambridge History than he became President of the United States. And here, no sooner had Simon Harris launched Making Empire, and he became Taoiseach. So if I ever invite you to launch a book, let's think about what comes next.
You're not planning an American launch, invite Kamala Harris to launch it? And
Well, Patrick, actually, and Kamala Harris's story, of course, is a very interesting one, because her father is of Irish provenance. He's from Jamaica. And Kamala Harris's story probably takes us into very dark places in terms of many people, either with Irish names or of Irish provenance, from the Caribbean, either took the names of their Irish slave masters, or they were the products of non-consensual sex, they, you know, the product of rape. Now, I'm not entirely sure what exactly Kamala Harris's story is, but I think it's going to be a very interesting one if she does. Obviously, personally, I can't wait. Let's hope she does. Yeah, we won't say anything else.
I think warm support for that. There's a phrase you use that I think really captures what you're talking about in the book, that Ireland became a laboratory for empire, that the English administrators were testing out their ideas in Ireland before they would introduce them in the rest of the world.
Yeah, and this idea of Ireland as a laboratory for empire isn't necessarily a new one. Colleagues like D.B. Quinn and Nicholas Canny really talked about it in the context of the Atlantic world. What I do is I extend it really to a global conversation. So what I argue in the book is people, mostly men, and it is men from England, learn the business of empire in Ireland before then going around the world, but also ideas, institutions, law. These practices are, if you want, tried and tested in Ireland before being exported, initially around the Atlantic world and then globally. Just a single example to try and illustrate this for you. I don't know if Giraldus Cambrensis, let's go back to the 12th century. Gerald of Wales published a very important book called Topographia in Latin that denigrated everything Irish and basically celebrated everything English. the Irish were uncivil, they were barbarous, they were savages. Now, this was a bestseller in as far as a medieval manuscript can be. It was reprinted then in English in the 15th, 16th centuries, and it really does become a bestseller. And somebody called Edmund Spenser, often heralded as a great Renaissance poet, he takes up many of these ideas that are essentially ethnocentric ideas about cultural superiority, but he sort of goes at them on steroids, because instead of saying, well, we can reform the Irish, he says, no, we need to basically exterminate, get rid of everything Irish culture, Irish practices, and replace it with everything English, including the Protestant religion. Now, Spenser was hugely important, not just in the context of the 17th century, where he really shaped political thinking, but also he then became a foundational text that was used by largely administrators working in the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so these ideas about cultural superiority and the English basically being somehow superior to the Irish were then, of course, taken and modified and used in particularly in Africa, but also in Asia. And that, for me, is a very interesting example of Ireland being used as a laboratory. And, of course, ethnocentricity then turns into racism as time passes. And there are many examples like that, Patrick, that I talk about in the book.
And it's even interesting, the subtitle, Ireland, Imperialism and the early modern world. But when you see the word imperialism now, people automatically have a reaction against it. Imperialism is a bad thing. When Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, both parts of that phrase were seen as negative. But in the 19th century, when you have Irish involved in India and in the earlier centuries, empire was seen as a great thing to be involved in, and it was seen as something positive, and you had Irish arguing, we want to have a greater share in this empire. It wasn't seen as something that they were running away from.
No, very much so. I think the other important point is that basically empires dominated the history of the world for millennia. It's nation states that are, if you want, the blips on the historical horizon. And even though you might have nation states or kingdoms within empires, it's basically imperial frameworks that are so important. And Ireland, of course, is no exception at all. And what's interesting to me is, of course, that Ireland allows us to explore the operation of empire at home. Let's face it, hundreds of thousands of colonists came from England, Scotland, and Wales and planted, that's the language of the day, large parts of Munster, Ulster, and other parts of the country. And along with that, they brought this desire to introduce what we would call today cultural imperialism, the English language, English dress, English ways of life, but also English architecture, English commercial practices, urbanization, because it's not just about conquering Ireland and introducing cultural imperialism. It's also about creating a subservient economy and one that works for England. So Ireland is very much in that. It's an integral part of the English, and I say English very consciously, and then by the 18th century, it's a British empire, and it's all-encompassing. It has a very dramatic effect on Ireland, so we can't ignore imperialism. It was such an important part of our history.
So what role were Irish people playing in that? Was it as administrators, soldiers, traders? What were the different jobs, and I suppose what were the different dimensions? So,
I mean, you see the Irish everywhere. They're ubiquitous, both in terms of what they do and where they go. But by the mid-17th century, the Irish are all over the spiritual empires of Spain and Portugal. That means they're very active, particularly with the Jesuits and with the Franciscans. It took them everywhere from the Philippines to Sao Paulo, to Florida, and then all across Europe. We also see the Irish as very, very sophisticated merchants with very elaborate mercantile networks. And I'm talking here Catholic as well as Protestant merchants. So in London, you have these great Catholic houses that then tap in, if you want, to the Spanish and French global empires. But then we also find Irish merchants all over those empires, as well as the British one. So they're then soldiers, merchants and soldiers. The Irish are skilled swordsmen. They fight very extensively in the continental armies. This is the Irish Catholics. And then from Spain or from France, they go into those global empires as swordsmen, and there are numerous examples of that, especially after 1690. You see them in increased numbers. But there's another big area where we see the Irish abroad. It's actually as governors. The Irish are very effective as men on the frontier. And so, for example, the first and only Irish Catholic who was governor of New York is a man called Thomas Dungan. And he had formerly been in Tangier, again, as an Irish Catholic, and he goes on to be a very, very important governor of New York in the 1690s. If we're looking for a Protestant example, it would be the great city of Mumbai, Bombay, where we have a man called Gerald Ainger from a Protestant planter family. He was third generation Irish. He goes out as a member of the East India Company. Now he's going out as a merchant, but he also then has a role as the governor of Surat and the governor of Bombay. He's the founding father of Bombay, actually. And Ainger is so important because he colonizes and plants Bombay, just as his grandparents have Ireland. And then, of course, he remits his treasure back to Ireland in the 1670s, and his brother is a property developer, and he develops a suburb called Ainger Street, just literally down the road. So next time you walk up Ainger Street, don't be fooled by the 19th century facades that you see. That whole suburb was developed on the back of treasure remitted from India to the Earl of Longford. And then there's a third capacity that I want to just talk a little bit about. It's how Irish labour actually is critical in the production of tobacco and sugar, particularly in the Caribbean, but also the Chesapeake, Maryland and Virginia. And these are Irish indentured servants who from the 1620s are, some go voluntarily. In the 1650s, Cromwell literally rounds them up and ships them over to Jamaica and Barbados. But before you have black chattel slaves working in the Caribbean, that comes from the 1660s on, you have white labour, and the Irish would be predominantly the whites who are working in those sugar and tobacco fields. And I've looked at these censuses that survive from the 1670s. And when you look at somewhere, say, like Barbados or the Leeward Islands, Montserrat, which is the Irish island, or Barbados, Jamaica, you'll see that the Irish are there as slave owners. They're there as overseers on plantations, but above all, they're there as the indentured servants. A third of them are female, and the majority are Irish speakers, and they're predominantly Catholic. And I had the privilege of actually visiting Barbados back in the spring and actually going onto one of these sugar plantations where the sugar cane was being harvested, still as it would have been in the 17th century. It is backbreaking work, and of course the heat, the humidity, the conditions. If people survived the voyage, there was an attrition, death rate of 50%. I mean, this was extraordinarily grueling work, Patrick, and we find the Irish there. And then at sea, we find the Irish as mariners in the Royal Navies, but also operating as pirates and privateers. We've got some wonderful examples of Irish pirates, including Anne Bonny from Cork. I mean, there's just wonderful stuff. So it's a very mixed story, and one size doesn't fit all here.
How come Ireland escaped without its reputation being damaged. You know, in Britain you have people always having to make apologies for what their ancestors have done, but around the world, Ireland is loved, Irish people are welcomed. You know, people don't say, oh, a lot of Irish came here and were oppressors or soldiers or anything like that. The Irish reputation seems to be untainted.
I'm not so sure it's completely untainted. I think people have such goodwill for Ireland. But again, going back to Barbados and meeting people living in Barbados, they're very aware of this complex relationship with Ireland. So on the one hand, yes, they love Ireland. And in Montserrat, St. Patrick's Day is the only place outside of Ireland where St. Patrick's Day is an official holiday. But it also marks a big slave rebellion that took place on that day. And when you talk to people in the Caribbean, they're very aware of the complexities behind it. But there's also this sense of empathy because those indentured servants often made common cause with the black enslaved population. And so there were multiple rebellions. So there's that sense of camaraderie as well, even though whiteness did afford some degree of privilege. Of course it did, but there's also that sense of camaraderie. There was just one other thing. I couldn't get over it. You open the phone book in somewhere like Montserrat or Barbados, and you just go through the names. I mean, everywhere you look, there's Butlers, Hussies, Gagans, no Ohlmeyers, but I mean, it was just extraordinary to see how many people of Irish provenance, their descendants are there today. And then in Barbados, you have a very sad community of what they call the Redlegs. These are people, direct descendants of those indentured servants, who then remained as a completely isolated community. And when you talk to the Bajans or the Barbadians about these poor whites, they call them the Ecky-Beckys and the Johnny Backrows. And I was like, why? And Ecky-Becky, because the way the sun has destroyed their skin. And Johnny Backrow, because they sit in the back row of the church. They're the poorest of the poor. And yet when you hear them speak, it's with an Irish accent. It's really quite extraordinary to see how that... So again, it's a really interesting and complex story on the ground as well.
And what about Irish people who resisted empire? Do we have examples, and many examples around the world, of Irish people who were directly involved in trying to stand up and oppose this?
Absolutely, we do. So probably one of the earliest, and one of the, I think, a really interesting example, is a man called William Lamport. So William Lamport and his siblings left Wexford in the 1620s. They went to Spain, where his sister Catherine became a nun. Another brother became a soldier in the armies of Philip IV. Another one became a Franciscan priest. And then William studied, and he went off to New Mexico, part of the Spanish Atlantic Empire, where he proclaimed himself the king and said that he was the legitimate king. I think, yes. Anyway, so of course the King of Spain was horrified by this, and the Inquisition went after William Lamport. But he is, and then of course he was executed. But we've got this incredibly detailed account of William Lamport's life, and how he drew up, if you want, a declaration of independence for Mexico that freed the slaves and basically said, we're all equal. So he was way ahead of his time. And today, if you go to Mexico City, William Lamport is sort of celebrated as Mexico's first freedom fighter. And equally, you go to Peru, where I was quite recently, and the Viceroy of Peru was a man called Ambrose Higgins. And his son, Bernardo O'Higgins, and Ambrose was born in Sligo, and again had gone to Spain, and from Spain went over to the Spanish Atlantic Empire. Anyway, he was a governor in Peru and very much a servant of empire, but Bernardo, his son, was in Chile, and he became one of the first freedom fighters in terms of throwing off Spanish rule. So in the same family, you've got a freedom fighter and you've got a governor, and you see that across Latin America. And we also see it in India, actually, as well, where the Irish taught the Indian freedom fighters the sort of ABC of freedom fighting. And it's very interesting to look at that relationship from the 1890s, and it's sort of cultural as well as political, because Tagore and Yeats admired each other hugely. Rabindranath Tagore, of course, that great polymath, the first Asian to win a Nobel Prize for Literature. And the book he won it for, Yeats had written the preface to it. It was called Gitanjali. But on the one hand, you had this relationship, but then Irish Home Rule. Very interesting to see how the Indian Home Rule movement, which was led by an Irish woman called Annie Besant, watched Parnell and what was going on in Ireland. Michael Davitt, the great Land League, Gandhi was hugely influenced by Michael Davitt, as was a man called Nauroji, who would have been one of the great, I think he's the first Indian to become an MP in the Westminster Parliament. And at one point, it was going to be for an Irish constituency. In the end, that didn't happen. And then, as we fast forward, we see Irish nationalists really becoming, if you want, heroes for the Bengali nationalists, whether it's Michael Collins or, basically, all of the Irish freedom fighters were celebrated in Bengal, and there was a copycat rising of 1916 in a place called Chittagong. Now that was in Easter 1931, but in the pockets of the insurgents, there were these little inspirational quotes from Pearse, and they clearly modeled their rebellion on that of Ireland. And De Valera was very clear about, India's cause is Ireland's cause. And De Valera he only ever visited India once. It was in 1947 as part of an anti-partition tour, because of course, like Ireland, India was partitioned. And incidentally, Patrick, it was actually the same legislation partitioned both countries as it did Israel and Palestine. Anyway, De Valera went as part of this anti-partition tour, and the viceroy at the time was, of course, Mountbatten. And Mountbatten's last act as Viceroy of India was to host a dinner party for Nehru and De Valera. And I just think, it's these ironies and these twists within twists.
How should we come to terms with the legacy of empire in this country? Because you have the legacy of how the Irish contributed to empires around the world, but then also how Ireland was itself changed by empire and what was coming back, and money and ideas. And so it was also reshaping this country.
Very much so. And if we just focus for a moment on food, the potato. I've just come from Peru. There are 2,000 varieties of papas, of potatoes, but it was from the Andes that the potato came to Ireland. And of course, it's ours. One of the guides said, "Oh, you're from Ireland. You're going to claim, I said, "No, I'm not going to claim it." But I mean, it's hard for us to think of it, the potato. And remember, the potato came not with Sir Walter Raleigh. I hate to be a killjoy, but it came via Spain, actually. And it was a luxury crop to begin with. And then from the mid-17th century, it becomes a staple crop. Sugar. Another really good example, it begins as an elite crop, or only the elite could afford sugar. By the late 17th century, everybody in Ireland is addicted to sugar, and it profoundly influences how we eat. And our colleague Susan Flavin has done some amazing work, actually, looking at the impact of, if you want, food from empires and how it has shaped our tastes here. But the other thing is tobacco. Tobacco, of course, came from the Americas, and by the early 17th century, people in Ireland were addicted to it. Potatoes and sugar were top down, whereas potato and sugar were top down. Tobacco was bottom up. It was very much, William Petty estimated that something like a third of the wealth of Irish peasants was spent on purchasing tobacco. I mean, that's a huge amount of tobacco. And we know this from all of the pipes that we find in archaeological digs. So, when you start to think about it like that, but also think of the landscape. Dublin is an imperial city. It was the second city of empire. Munster was transformed because basically Ireland fed the Caribbean, and particularly the Munster ports and Cork, as well as Dublin itself. Some people prospered very much on the back of it. And then we have the landscape. The plantation completely shaped the Irish landscape. Obviously, a lot of deforestation, and then things like tobacco duties paid for the front facade of Trinity, the front gate of Trinity, and other buildings were funded on the back of tobacco and sugar. So, there's many ways of looking at it in Ireland today.
The Ford lectures were a huge success. The book has been a huge success. Have you been a little bit shocked to suddenly wake up and find that early modern history has suddenly become sexy? There's the big crowd today. In the past, you really needed to work on 20th century, to put 1916 Rising in the title of something to get a big crowd, to get that level of interest. But now, because of debates going on about Black Lives Matters and about decolonialization and the curriculum and statues and everything, that suddenly there is a huge appetite and a huge interest in this.
I'm amazed. I'm completely amazed. Listen, I've been working on issues of empire for 30 years and nobody was blind, not the slightest bit interested. So it's really exciting to have this conversation. I think a number of points I would make. I think Ireland, there's a political maturity in Ireland that allows us to have these conversations. Forget the crazies on social media. You can have really good, robust debates and discussions that are respectful and well-informed. In Ireland, you can't necessarily have those in England. It's very, and you certainly can't have them in the United States. I was supposed to talk in Colombia about the book, and because of the ongoing protests there, it's just impossible at the moment. Now, other places you can talk about it in the States, but it's very, very, it's touching a lot of raw nerves, Patrick. So I think we're very lucky in Ireland. I think this is partly as a result of, well, statues must fall. Most of our statues have fallen, let's face it. There's a couple in Northern Ireland that are a bit dubious, but certainly in the Republic of Ireland there are very few, although John Mitchell, there's still statues or things named after John Mitchell. Even Edmund Burke, in front of Trinity. It's important to remember Edmund Burke, and I realise, Patrick, you probably quite like Edmund Burke, so I have to be careful, but Edmund Burke was the MP for Bristol, which was the great slave, most of his constituents would have been involved in the slave trade, and his brother actually owned plantations in the Caribbean. So even somebody like Burke, who did so much to, if you want, criticise empire, especially in India, would have been would have had very close associations with it. So I think by having this conversation, you are allowing people to better understand just how complicated and complex things are. And that nuance allows us then to have, I think, a much more enriched discussion about it. I was very proud of Trinity. Obviously, our colleague Kieran O'Neill and Patrick Walsh have been leading there with a big colonial legacies project that resulted in human remains going back to Inishbofin. Now, the tragedy is that Trinity took the skulls and the human remains in the first place in the 1890s, and it did take quite a long time to get them back. But actually, by Trinity standards, it was a very smooth... I have to be very careful what I say. But the most important thing is they've gone back. And I think that museums, galleries, universities are using this moment to really reflect on the provenance of their collections and saying, and it's complicated, folks. There's no quick and easy solution here. And I think that awareness, to be part of that conversation, is terrific.
Well, Jane has said that when we discuss these issues, there's a much more respectful, enlightened, and rich debate. Well, now let's test that by inviting you to ask some questions. So we have some roving microphones, so we might take...